segunda vivieron, gracias Flor, la segunda vivieron un simulador que espero que hayan disfrutado, tanto como lo han disfrutado otros niveles organizacionales y otros equipos también, y aprendido, ¿no? Que es lo importante. El día de hoy van a analizar un caso y la sesión va a estar a cargo de Dennis Baltley, que ya lo conocen. Así que, I don't know if I'm forgetting to say anything, Dennis, Danny, but please, let's go. Let's start.
Thank you, Britt.
I'm almost there on the slide. Sorry about that. That's me. And can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. What we're going to be doing, there we go, like magic. Okay. So what we're going to be doing today is talking about leading the most difficult change. And as Britt said, we started with, I think it's good, Britt, you did a nice reminder as we go through, and I'll just want to recap that. So we've had Alvaro talk about the importance of personal change. We've talked about how AliCorp approaches change, what kind of toolkits available to us, what are some of the examples. We then got to jump into this simulation Britt mentioned and look at systems level change. And what does that take, which is always very interesting. Today, we're going to talk about how do we lead the most difficult change? What is the really hard change? And why is it hard? And what can we do about it? That's going to be most of our today. And then tomorrow, we're going to be doing the external case. We'll be doing the trouble it to Psy case and then talking with the director. So today, we're going to mostly be talking about how do we lead the most difficult change. And then at the end of the session today, we're going to give you some time in some small groups to start working on your own playbook. Like, how am I leading change in the current context? So we're going to talk a little bit about that and make sure you have some time to think for yourselves after we've talked about this difficult change piece. Okay, so I did want to, well, let me start over here. So does anybody remember Charles Darwin? And what's the phrase or the quote that Darwin is most famous for? Anybody remember? Get my chat open here. What is Darwin famous for? There's a particular quote or something that people think of when they think of Charles Darwin. What is that? Yeah, thanks, Jose. That's right. So a lot of times you'll hear in the popular press, people attribute the quote to Darwin, survival of the fittest. And that's actually popular culture, but that's not what he said. So I think what's interesting for us, and I want to start off this idea about adaptive change, you're going to hear me talk more about it. What Darwin actually said was, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent. It's the one that is the most adaptive to change. And so you were right on the money as we were getting in here. So the idea of adaptive leadership, the really difficult change, has its roots in evolutionary biology, which is the adaptive nature of species. And this is based on some work done some time ago by two guys from Harvard, Linsky and Heifetz. Ron Heifetz still teaches a lot today. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what is really hard, why, and we're going to get you into two breakouts to grapple with some of these concepts, and then we're going to do some open forum discussions along the way. We'll take a couple of breaks, I promise, along the way as well. So the first point I want to make is that here's the process we're going to walk through. this is what we do in every change initiative. We separate what's precious about our history, about our best practices, from what's expendable, the things that we need to let go of in order to take on new practices. So we separate the precious from the expendable. And then we do experiments and we take some smart risks. We try some things and see what fits with what we need. And then we do that disciplined assessment and we integrate those next practices in. It's pretty classic. It's what we mostly always do when we're grappling with change that we're learning as we go. And the point that I want to make here is, even if it seems like the change that we face is incredibly large and that it's changing everything, it's very rare that any systems level change in an organization is more than 20%. It's very rare that more than 20% of the organization changes. It feels like more. It feels like most things are changing, but the fact is that they're probably not. Usually 75 to 80% of the core organizational practices stay intact, even in the most difficult and big change. But the felt sense of impact on people is quite different. Let me just check my pace. Is the pace going okay for folks? Yeah, thanks, Danny. So this idea of adaptive leadership is, it feels big, it has a big impact on people when it's hard, but in reality, it's not really big. And the definition that Linsky and Heifetz uses for this idea of adaptive change is, you might think it's a little funny, but I want to describe it. So they say this idea of us having skills in leading adaptive types of change is the ability to disappoint people at a rate that they can absorb. And it sounds a little bit negative, or it can be a little bit funny, but the point is this: so it's the ability to disappoint people, but at a rate that they can absorb. And so the idea is, there are people that work for you that would step in front of a bus for you. They would do anything for you. And you've got to help them get to a new place, and they're not going to like it. And so how do you help these highly committed people get to a new place when they're going to be uncomfortable? They're going to be disappointed, and yet we don't want them to disengage and check out. So how do we manage that discomfort? They need to be a little bit disrupted. Pardon me. They need to be a little bit disrupted. They need to be a little bit uncomfortable, but they have to keep moving through these difficult changes. So that's kind of the heart of what we're going to be talking about. What are those few stages that we can help people get through that hard stuff? If you have questions along the way, please use the chat. Danny and I will be monitoring it and checking. We are more than happy to catch questions and chat around these ideas along the way. So all this has been the setup to say, here's our journey through. We're going to talk about how do we get on the balcony and identify truly adaptive challenges. And here I'll make a distinction between adaptive challenges and technical challenges. Then the second conversation we're going to have is, how do you navigate the corporate immune system? And here you're going to hear me say every system, whether it's a person or an animal or an organization or a government, any system strives for equilibrium. Systems don't like change. They strive for equilibrium. And so therefore, anytime change, it's not good or bad, it's just the way systems are built. When we try to bring changes in, when we try to advance our thinking, then the corporate immune systems come out and try to kill off that change. So we're going to talk about what's that look like and how do you navigate those corporate immune systems. And one of the ways we do that with our people is, can we actually name the conflict they have and regulate their distress? And how do we do that in the end? Then in the part 3, in a more open forum, we're just going to chat about the big ideas for us as leaders. Is you have to give the work back. You can't have people give you the work all the time when it gets hard. How do you give the work back, and how do we identify work avoidance? When is it people are not really focused on what's most important, and how can we see it coming? And then what do we do about it? So those are the 3 chapters. that we're going to be working through as we talk and frame our ideas around difficult change. Now, as part of our pre-work, you will have identified a leadership challenge that is personally important to you. You'll have an idea about a change challenge that you're in the middle of or that you're about to start on, but it should be a tough one, but it should be personally important to you that it goes well. And so when we get into these breakouts that I'm going to set up in a little bit, you'll be thinking about your change challenge and hearing some of the change challenges of others around the table. And we're going to use these different lenses from adaptive change and adaptive leadership to examine our own challenges. All right, so I had talked about this idea of get on the balcony, and how do we name the adaptive challenge? So if many of us, if we love doing stuff, if we love executing, then we probably spend a lot of time on the dance floor. And so the dance floor is where the action occurs. But the problem is, if you are on the dance floor, if you only can see what you're doing and what's happening right around you, then you can't see the patterns. And so one of the big ideas when we start talking about addressing an adaptive challenge is, how will I get on the balcony? How do I get high enough over this change to be able to see the patterns of how people are interacting and how people are talking about it? It's the way you get a holistic perspective, and it's the way we think about systems change. So the idea of getting on the balcony is very much about our ability to generate some hypotheses about technical challenges versus adaptive ones. And I'm going to make that distinction for us in a moment. It's also an important way for us to get enough distance from the problem to get the true feelings, what is being said, but what's also not being said. And here, I think one of the really important ideas around really hard change, leading hard change, is, in my experience, people don't resist change. People resist loss. And when we think about a change that we want to implement, we should be able to describe the felt sense of loss that people are experiencing. And if we can't describe that loss that we believe they feel, then we don't quite have it. We don't have enough clarity on what's not being said yet. So I don't think people resist the change itself, whether it's an SAP implementation or whether it's a shift in how we have to think about supply chain. It is some sense of loss. If they're resisting, it's because there's loss. And can we describe it clearly? We have a chance to tackle it. And we'll talk some more about that. So number one is get on the balcony. Then here is the important distinction I've been talking about. Some of the challenges we face are technical on the left. In technical challenges, the problem is clear. There is a known solution, right? We have a new version of Microsoft PowerPoint. It is a little bit different, but largely the same. It's a technical problem. It is a few things that we have to learn that's a little bit different. The solution is arrived at through authority and expertise. So many of the challenges we face are technical. It's hard work, but it's clear what the problem is. There is an answer, and experts can solve it. And the contrast I want to make is the hardest change sits on the right. Adaptive change says it's not something we faced quite like this before. It requires us to learn. The answer is not clear. It's going to require some experimentation. We're going to have to try some things before we know what the exact and proper direction is. And it will not be solved through expertise, because the expertise doesn't apply directly. It will be solved through leadership and through stakeholder management. We're going to be talking to a range of people, and we're going to have to take a bet. We're going to have to take a stance as a leader to try some things and see how they work. So as you're thinking about your change challenge, some elements of it will be technical, but if it's hard, some of it's going to be adaptive. And so just as a quick summary on that, on the technical side, The work is work we know and we can do using the expertise largely that we have. It is easy to quantify success. We know what it means when we win. And it's hard, but it's not disorienting. People don't get disrupted and disoriented in it. And people may not be central to the solution. It may be about logic, it may be about structure, it may be about having a better business plan or a project plan. And the ownership is clear. So you do have an approval when this change is rolled out in structure. Those are the features of a technical challenge. On an adaptive challenge, it is work that we don't really know, and it requires something different of us. It requires us to think differently. It's typically messy. It's not linear. We try some things, they're not quite right. We have to adapt to it and try some other things. It leads us to someplace else. There's often high emotions tied to adaptive challenges. When something hits people strongly, it means there's something adaptive about it that's requiring them to feel like they've stepped into the unknown. And one of the key features of an adaptive challenge is that the people with the problem are almost always part of the problem. It is, we think in one way, but we have to act and be in another way. Ownership is rarely a single line of sight within a single area of expertise. It's usually broad because it affects the broader set of the organization. And so therefore, when we talk about stakeholder leadership, it's unlikely to be solved just within your function, just within your business line, or just within your country. So those are the big differentiations about the challenges we face. The hard stuff has both. It'll have both technical and adaptive. And so here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to get you into a breakout group, and let's make these for let's make this for 30 minutes, Flor.
Great.
So here's your question. You should get out your personal change challenge and be able, in the time, since we're having a good chunk of time, we're going to have a good 30 minutes. I want you to be able to go around the table, in your group and say, here's my challenge. Here's some of it that I think is technical and adaptive. But the real questions to work through, and Flor will put these into the chat, are, have you gathered enough data? Do you know enough about your change challenge to know what's being said about it? And where do you look to find out what's not being said? Is there a felt sense of loss that people have in this change that you're implementing? Or does somebody feel like they're losing something and it hasn't been said? And how would you find out? Second is, are there some elements of your challenge that are adaptive? It might even feel like this is a pretty straightforward technical adaptation, technical change effort, but there will be some elements that are adaptive. They require learning. They're not going to be solved through expertise. We're going to have to try some experiments. What would be some of those adaptive ideas? And then finally, I talked about the need for leadership and stakeholder management. One of the ways that you solve adaptive problems is that you make a little bit of space for a diversity of interpretations and ideas. If we are on the right side, that adaptive side of the change, and we try to use only our personal view to drive it forward, I guarantee you we will miss something. And so where is that space for a diversity of ideas, a diversity of interpretations? Who is it that gives us some other views? Because if experimentation is required, we're going to need a broader range of views than just our own. So where do I look for what's not being said? What kind of things are adaptive in my challenge that are not going to be solved by expertise? And then how am I going to make sure I have enough range of thoughts when I hit those adaptive pieces? If you have questions, raise your hand and Flor will drop Danny or I into the group, and we're happy to help you move forward. But let's get to know our leadership challenges from which parts of it are most adaptive. Whenever you're ready, Flor.
Gracias, Denis. Y solo un recordatorio que una vez que estén dentro del breakout room pueden presionar el botón de chat y las preguntas les van a aparecer allí.
Good. I think a little bit of framing about this idea of technical and adaptive, and then getting you to share some stories, I think is actually just huge. And I was, hey, Lord, I was just talking to Britt at the break of, you know, when we started this journey with on Ella, it was, we have got to get our head around global and integrated in some ways that we never had. And then pandemic, boom. Then there was a pandemic firestorm. And then you've got this socio-political issues that are just you're in the middle of in Peru. And then, you know, the next thing is going to be climate change. You know, so there will always be these big external waves of change coming, and how we adjust to those is just super high value for us. We're going to talk a little more about that. But we had 5 teams, and I want to get you to a break here in a few minutes. So I want to hear from a couple. I'd like a couple people to jump in and say, what did you talk about? How was that conversation about adaptive versus technical, or being able to really get after what it is that the concerns are or the issues are? Who'd like to jump in? How'd your chat go?
Don José.
Yo puedo contar. Sí, si les parece. En nuestro grupo hablamos de la parte técnica y la parte adaptativa, pero creo que nos enfocamos mucho más en compartir experiencias adaptativas. ¿Y en qué sentido? De los diferentes estadios en los que estamos, cada uno de los integrantes del equipo, en el manejo de personas y en el manejo que viene liderando equipos en remoto, aprendiendo a interpretar lo que están sintiendo a la distancia, donde no siempre puedes verlos, y el tema de gestos o de actitudes ya no es fácil de descifrar, y tienes que desarrollar un sentido adicional para ver los tonos de voz, el cómo te escriben, el qué te dicen, para entender cómo se están sintiendo. Y no solo por la pandemia, sino también por cambios que pueden haber en la organización, en las formas de trabajar ante los contextos que comentaba Denis, que son complejos, por lo menos en Perú. Entonces, en el equipo había una mixtura de trabajo en remoto, de trabajo presencial, y cómo nos afecta el liderar equipos desde cada uno de esos frentes. Entonces, sí nos enfocamos bastante más en la parte adaptativa.
Si quieren, yo sigo ahí con un ejemplo que hoy estamos viviendo muchos y que tiene una parte importante, diría una base técnica fuerte, que es Fénix, ¿no? SAP por HANA y todo lo que ha implicado, y una parte importante y muy fuerte que estamos viviendo hoy, que es la parte adaptativa, que tiene que ver con change y con adopción. En el grupo, justo ayer había un incidente específico con un tema técnico de Carlitos Espinosa de Vitapro, y exploramos un poco respondiendo a estas 3 preguntas, ¿no? ¿Qué había pasado? Pero al final, en el ejemplo, es un mix importante entre la parte técnica, pero que la parte técnica no te va a resolver solo el proceso, ¿no? Sino que tienes que añadir temas de gente, temas de qué tanto tú como líder también estás dispuesto a abrazar el cambio para hacerlo más productivo, ¿no? Pero creo que es un ejemplo que muchos vivimos y que hoy estamos en la parte de ya de adopción, luego de una salida en vivo, y donde la parte adaptativa viene siendo la más fuerte, ¿no?
Like, Laura, you look so cold. I think you've got like, my gosh, you could tell it's still winter there. So yeah. So I love it. And the first idea, the idea of the Zoom and distance and the second lockdown, and some countries haven't moved out of their first lockdown, means people are feeling personally disrupted because of the socio-political, the things that are going on in the world, and you're at a distance and you can't see it. So I love that idea that it's hard to lead change because people are isolated, as you were saying, Natalia, and they are feeling disconnected, or it's hard to focus. There's so much going on that it's even hard to talk to people about the priorities because because of those features. And then Laura, when this idea of, now, one of your senior leaders, I'm not going to call out them by name, but one of your senior leaders had said to me recently, well, we say we do scenario planning, but what we do is scenario doing, because we're doers. We're like, we act, we move. And so sometimes our tendency is to treat things like technical challenges because we think those are things we can go fast on. And we know how to fix some technical challenges. And so, Laura, I loved it. How do we create the speed bump to say, people are usually going to be the issue. And we often will try to drive right through by providing clarity, by providing project plans, by having frequent communications, but those will not fix the most difficult challenges. There's just going to have to be us dealing with the hard issues of people changing and making those personal adjustments as we go through. Great. One more. Is there one other thought from your conversation? One other idea?
Algo más que ahí, escuchándote, Denis, podría decir es, podrías tener tú la herramienta perfecta, ¿no? El software perfecta, pero si nadie la usa correctamente, realmente perdimos 3 años de trabajo. Entonces, yes. ¿Cómo lo usamos, no? Si yo estaba acostumbrado a hacer 1, 2, 3, y ahora tengo que hacer 1, 3, 2, y no lo entiendo, no me suma a mi proceso, no lo voy a usar. Entonces creo que las dos partes son importantes, pero hoy, y hablando de este ejemplo específico, la parte adaptativa hace que Phoenix sea exitoso.
I think it's a good reminder the world is full of complex, perfect tools that nobody uses. Or and a few things done well with practice is always better than a more thorough, complex piece that nobody will use or they can't understand. I think before we go to a break, Jose, I think you were going to jump in there.
Sí, explicando un poco lo que conversamos en el equipo, pero conecto con lo que mencionaba Lorena, que también empezamos a conversar bastante y era de lo que pierde cada uno, ¿no? O sea, preguntarnos qué pierde la persona que está siendo afecta, entre comillas, al cambio, y sobre eso también empezar a construir, ¿no? Y a levantar información sobre todos los posibles impactos que podríamos tener en las distintas personas que van a ser protagonistas del cambio, ¿no? Tomábamos como ejemplo, Sebastián nos contaba el reto que tienen en el negocio de acuicultura y toda esta transformación que están ahorita teniendo. Y sí, también veíamos un tema importante en el que no todas las audiencias son iguales, ¿no? O sea, de repente decantar un mensaje, tenemos que cambiar por esto, por esto, por esto. Quizás haya, por ejemplo, una parte técnica en la que el detalle tenga que ser mayor para explicarles por qué estamos yendo a este cambio, ¿no? Quizás hayan otros perfiles que no necesiten tanto detalle o que las preguntas vayan por distintos caminos. Entonces, conocer bastante bien eso para ver cómo estamos impactando en las personas y sobre todo cómo podríamos armar esto para tener más probabilidad de éxito, ¿no?
I love that, Jose, and and if I'm not catching the translation perfectly, but I love this. So there's oftentimes we spend quite a bit of effort on clarity. We want to be very clear about what this change is and what it means, and sometimes we miss how it hits people and what's the impact on them, and so we don't see it as clearly because we're striving for. Right. So I think that's a really interesting piece. That is, we should be spending as much time on how does that make sense and what will you do as we are on just getting the message and clarity into the storyline. Because there's an old Austrian quote about change management. It's not about change management, but it applies to change management. And it says that the grass doesn't grow any faster when you pull on it. And so there is some amount of change does take some time. You can't actually jerk people through it, but they have to actually make the adaptation themselves. as they go through. So we can help them along. Sometimes we can speed it up, but you can't make them go through it a lot faster. So I love that. Let's, Floor, you're going to set us up for about 8-minute break. Let's take an 8-minute break. Everybody stand up, take a walk, get your thoughts together, get a drink, and then we'll start with chapter 2. Real quick break. All right. Thanks, Floor. All right. As I was saying before, please do use the chat. If you have questions or you have thoughts or observations, just put them in the chat. Danny and I, if I'm talking, Danny will be checking the chat, but do not hesitate to start the conversation in our chat box, in a chat off to the side, and I'll get to it, Danny will get to it, or others will certainly have thoughts or observations. So chapter 1 was about just what is this difference between technical and adaptive? How will I get on the balcony to actually see the patterns of what's happening in these really hard changes for us? Chapter 2, our second set of conversations, is how do you navigate the corporate immune system? And how do we name the conflict and regulate the distress? This is, I think, when we start, the part 1 is simply, can I really distinguish which parts of the change that people will find disorienting? This part 2 is, don't underestimate the desire of human nature to maintain the status quo. People like to have some consistency, and some of us can get bored, but people like to protect the level of stability that we have. And so, as I was saying, a corporate immune system isn't evil. It isn't preventing us from doing something. It's just simply trying to protect itself by keeping a sense of equilibrium. And so that usually comes in 3 forms. One is precedent. That is, well, no, we've done it this way and we've been successful. It's usually people. That is, our people have been here a long time. We have found success formulas. We like to do it in certain ways, or it's process. There are ways that we think are the best. And when we face new situations, we think those old ways of doing things apply in new ways just as well. And so I have, let's see, I've got a funny, yep. So here's your math equation for the day. And it simply means this: when we think about the most difficult change in emerging and new situations, then here's your equation. And that is, preserving the past plus perfecting the present does not equal finding the future. And sometimes we think it does. And this is how the corporate immune systems are based on this logic, that preserving the past and perfecting the present will somehow make us more ready for the future. But it is often not the case when we are facing adaptive challenges. So that's point 1 here. And point 2 is, the way that you circumvent the immune system is through experimentation. And so the philosophy, the fundamental idea behind experimentation is, if you're experimenting, you have a desired outcome, but the path is unknown. We're trying different things to find the right path. Does anybody, let's use the chat, does anybody know how many experiments Google runs in a year? Every year? Anybody know? Just put a number in the chat. What's your guess? How many experiments does Google run in a year? $50 is a good guess, but it's low. $80 is a good guess, but it's low. 1,000. Andres, way to go big. Jose, way to go big. Yeah. So 20,000. Google runs 20,000 experiments a year. It is just part of the fabric of their culture. And that is, they're always trying new things. Sometimes it's just process improvements and speeding things up. Now, it's a bit of a cheat because they can segment off certain customer populations into a little sandbox, and they can try some new things. So of course they can run many more. But the point is, it's just part of the fabric of their culture to try. Try new things. And this idea of experiments allows us to see things as something to try. We don't have to bet everything. We don't have to say it all has to work and this is the way. It is, we're going to try it and we'll see what happens. It also allows us to do parallel processing. Sometimes we can try a couple of experiments in the same direction that are a little bit different. And one of the beauties about experiments is it stops our confirmation bias sometimes. It lets us look for data different than we expect. We're trying something. The data may not be exactly what we expect, therefore we can see it more clearly. So understanding why the system wants to come out and kill off your change, it's not a bad thing. It's just the system's natural reaction. Second, the way to get around it will be, how do we frame the experiments that we're going to try? And so here's where we are in the story. We begin with data collection and problem identification. We get on the balcony and we see, what are the patterns? What are the patterns of how people are operating and what are some of the things they're not saying about this change? Second is we make some interpretation. And one of the ways that we interpret what we're observing is trying to get to that diversity of views and opinions. Have I talked to enough people broadly so I can get the right, or at least a broad set of interpretations about what is it people are experiencing, what are the reactions that they're having, and then what are some of the ways forward that I should be experimenting and trying, and then conduct some of those experiments. Get to number 3, that is, what are the few smart risks that we can try? We'll try and see. So that's where we are in chapter 2. And then here's one of the important leadership capabilities in this chapter. That is, can we name the conflict and regulate the distress? And Danny, I'm not sure, what's the Spanish word for thermostat? Like a thermostat in your home?
Termostato.
Yep. Okay. Well, I should have figured that out, I guess, as we get in. So we have to think about when people are under pressure, they're disoriented. Part of our job is to turn up the heat. We have to turn up the pressure. We have to turn up the heat. But what you cannot do is flip it on high and then walk away. So we think about the conflict and pressure that people are under as a thermostat. We turn up the heat until we start seeing some forms of work avoidance, and then we turn the heat back. So we turn up the heat on the adaptive work they have to do. And when they start getting disoriented and when they start not staying focused, we turn the heat back a little bit and give them some technical work to do. Give people the technical work they can do. Let's get that into a project plan. Let's get that into a more orderly communication. And then we turn up the heat again. But our job is to sequence and pace the work. What we don't want to do is turn up the heat so high that people pop out the top into, they get frozen or they disengage, right? So we want them uncomfortable, but we don't want them disengaged. You'll see here in the middle, the peril, and this is an Alley Corp classic, right? The peril is oftentimes leaders convey that everything is important, that we start a lot of new initiatives and we don't like to stop others because we like to get things done. We like to do a lot of things. And so we can overwhelm and disorient the people who really need to take responsibility for their work. So 1, regulate the pressure. 2, we have to be mindful of the sequence and pace. And 3, we also personally have to have the emotional capacity to tolerate people's frustration. When they're going to be uncertain, they're going to be frustrated, and what you can't do is solve it for them. They have to grapple with it, and they have to help find ways forward because they're closer to the work and bring you ideas and bring you solutions. If we solve it for them every time, we end up disenabling them, which can happen quite a bit. So we don't want to do it like, good luck. We do want to do it with empathy. I know this is difficult, and part of your responsibility is to be bringing me new ideas and new thinking. That's the leadership part as we get through here. So here's what I'd like you to do. We're gonna put you back into these breakouts, and let me just check my time. We're not doing too badly here. So Flor, let's do this for 25 minutes and get people into a good conversation about what is it when we think about this idea of where will the corporate immune system emerge and start fighting your changes? Is it in precedent? Is it in people? Like, no, this particular leader just doesn't want to change. Or is it in precedent? That's not been part of our success formula. And so where's that corporate immune system likely to come out and try to change? And then how will you help people focus on the few things, right? Instead of, we got 20 things and we just added 10 more. How do we help people stay focused on the few things? And where are you likely to see the frustration and the uncertainty surface? We'll talk about that a bit more when you come back, but I bet you can predict where will people start getting frustrated? Where will they start becoming disoriented and maybe freeze or check out? Not check out, but they may freeze and wait when we really want them to move forward. And then this is a note for each of us. For ourselves is just, do we have a personal strategy to hold the tension? Can we hold that tension but show empathy? And this is the heart, of course, of leadership, is how do I both challenge and support? I need us to move forward, and I know it's difficult, but that balance is a personal equation that's very important for each of us to find. So those first 3 questions are for your breakout. Where's the corporate immune system going to pop out and try and mess up my change? And how do I help people stay focused on those few things that I know have to happen? And where is their frustration going to come up? Where am I going to see it come up? Let's try it, and then let's come back and talk about it. Let's go, Floor, when you're ready. So you've had a chance to talk a little bit about the corporate immune system. Where's frustration going to surface? If the immune system is going to come back and slow me down, or try to throw this change off track, where will that be? What kind of frustrations can I actually foresee that are going to surface when we get in? Let's hear from a couple of the other groups. But what did you talk about? What was interesting in the conversation you've had with a little bit of time? Who'd like to go?
Si quieres, yo comparto.
Thanks, Lloyd.
Equipo. Buenos días, Denise. A ver, un poco de lo que conversábamos con el equipo es que creo que esto se suma a muchos frentes, ¿no? El sistema inmunológico enfocado mucho en las personas, en los procesos, ¿no? En lo que en el día a día se va identificando, pero que el centro de todo este frente está, según nuestro criterio, un poco de lo que hemos concluido, está muy enfocado en las personas, ¿no? Y porque las personas van a percibir esas mejoras del desafío que estemos planteando y la van a difundir, la van a comunicar, la van a compartir, pero también van a percibir ciertas frustraciones, ciertas incertidumbres, porque no ven que el cambio llega hacia ellos, llega a sus procesos diarios, a su trabajo habitual. Entonces hay diferentes escenarios, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido, lo que veíamos también y compartíamos es que es clave que, muy aparte de la comunicación que podemos dar, del desafío que estemos atravesando, es clave escuchar a las personas, constantemente escucharlas, tener el feedback de ellos, el poder saber cómo adaptamos también las estrategias en función a ciertas necesidades y a esa escucha que estamos teniendo y que tendría que ser continua, ¿no? Y luego veíamos y compartíamos también que en nuestros casos, pues, aplicamos diferentes mecanismos para controlar esa frustración, esas incertidumbres, como por ejemplo compartir y conversar con otras personas ajenas al tema para tener un panorama amplio, ¿no? Brenda justo comentaba sobre eso, que compartíamos también. Y bueno, Ernesto nos decía que él contaba a veces, ¿no? Como para poder tratar de
de sobrellevar esa frustración que a veces podía pasarle. Y bueno, y creemos también que las frustraciones están muy centradas en que en el día a día tenemos algunos temas y a la vez aparecen diferentes desafíos, que el factor tiempo es el que genera muchas veces ese tipo de frustraciones o incertidumbres, ¿no? Eso es un poco, Denis, de lo que hemos ido conversando en el equipo. Muchas gracias.
No, very nice. And I love the idea that one of the ways that we stay tuned into the corporate immune system is sensing. Is like we're always sensing, like we're making sure that we're checking along the way. So we actually see the reaction, and therefore you'll see that resistance early. What you don't want is to be halfway through and someone say, well, nobody told me that, you know, that's a classic. And then the second thing that I love here is the, how do you reduce the frustration? Some of it is sharing and talking, but it's a good point that is sometimes we think that communication is about information sharing, but it's not. Communication is about connection, and it is about us being able to have a common conversation and be, you know, so we may not have new information. That doesn't mean that that connection isn't important, that people are still being brought along. So fantastic, fantastic. One more. Is there someone else who had some thoughts about their conversation? Let's do one more. Any of the groups? Now, some of you know me.
Hola a
yeah,
todos.
please, go ahead, Oscar.
Hola, ¿pueden escucharme? Ya.
Sí, Oscar, te
Gracias.
escuchamos.
Conversábamos con el equipo que una de las estrategias que podría ayudar a manejar esta situación, que yo lo veo como un arte también, ¿no? Manejar la tensión y a la vez esa muestra de empatía, es tener espacios informales con los equipos, donde de pronto en un ambiente más natural, más espontáneo, poder conversar y responder inquietudes, ¿no? También en el equipo salió el arte de preguntar, el arte de hacer preguntas, repreguntar, para poder llegar a esas inquietudes que tiene el equipo. Y también ser un facilitador para poder brindar los recursos para que el equipo esté tranquilo por ese lado. Eso quería compartir.
I like it. I think it's a great reminder on make it easy for people to share, make it easy for them to talk about it, and informal meetings help. This idea of questions, I think, is fabulous. I think we all know this, but sometimes we forget to do it well. What do powerful questions start with? What words do powerful questions always start with? You can just drop it in the chat, or you can come off of mute. When we think about the really powerful questions that we want to make sure we ask of our teams in those meetings, they usually start with one of three words. This is the test portion of your course. What are the powerful questions begin with? You can drop them in the chat. In decision making, one of the most underserved features of a decision-making model is the framing. We often don't frame well. And so therefore, the art of framing a decision or a change initiative well is in the art of making sure we framed our challenge as a powerful question. So this is actually very important. Great, great. Very nice, very nice. Yep. So powerful questions start with how, what, or why. Powerful questions start with how, what, or why. If you aren't starting with how, what, or why, then you might be asking a leading question. You're looking for a particular answer. Occasionally, very occasionally a powerful question starts with who, but sometimes who sounds like who thought that was a good idea, or who said that, right? And so sometimes who questions are dangerous, but you can't go wrong with how, what, or why. And if we don't start with those, we aren't inviting the kind of openness that we might want. So I think it's a quick, easy fix. Thanks for bringing up the idea of questions. It's a big one. Let's go into this third chapter and talk a little bit about that. And I need to have a bit fewer windows open here. All right. So this third chapter, and this one we're not going to do a breakout in. We're going to just have an open discussion here. We'll come off of mute or we'll use the chat. But this third idea then, the third chapter for us is we have to give the work back to people because, as you'll see in some of the language here, too often people look up the chain of command. So the two ideas we're going to talk about now are how do we give the work back and how do we battle work avoidance? How do we know what it looks like when we see it? And then how do we battle work avoidance? So as you can see, often people look up the chain of command, particularly when change is disorienting. People look up the chain of command, they look up the chain of command because they want you to give them the answer when it's hard. And when it's actually their responsibility, it's their responsibility because they're closest to the work to help come up with the experiments. But they may feel it's too risky or it's just hard work and they want you to give them guidance. So our work in the difficult change is not to let people be passive or not to let them use these little varieties of work avoidance to shield them from the need to change. We're going to talk about what the kinds of work avoidance show up are. But the idea is getting people to assume these greater responsibilities is not easy. Many people love a more directive management style when things are hard. Like, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. When in fact, as leaders, we need people to be bringing us the ideas, to be bringing us movement and momentum, trying things. So having them take the initiative means we have to learn how to support. And that's not so easy because sometimes we think we know the answer and we can help them go faster. And so we do want to tell them, but how do we help them with this challenge and support, as well as then helping them take responsibility for the work that they have to do is the magic here. Once we have a clear path on our adaptive changes. So that's the framing of the don't do their work for them. Second is work avoidance. These are the big five. There are plenty of other ways work avoidance shows up, but work avoidance is the resistance that emerges to protect the status quo. So whenever we try to move forward with something very different than what we've done, work avoidance shows up. It's the behavioral manifestation of the system trying to protect the status quo. And it shows up in these ways. Sometimes it shows up as denial. That is, this isn't really a problem. We're just making some changes, but this is working. So why would we change it? Sometimes it's escapism. Well, if there is a problem, it's not my problem. It's supply chain's problem. It's the field sales organization's problem. It's the center's problem. It's the function's problem. It's not my problem. And here is where escapism says, you know what? Yes, you can talk about that big thing, but I'm going to keep doing my spreadsheets over here or whatever it is that I've done in the past. That's escapism and not embracing it. Scapegoating is they, right? If only they would settle down, if only they would tell me, if only the government was clear about what they were doing exactly, we could respond appropriately. If only our senior leaders would stop changing things for a few months, we could just get on with doing our work. So that's scapegoating, which is there is constant turmoil. There is unknowns that will unfold over time. And yet there are still priorities of things we can do. Cynicism is number 4, and that is it's impossible. Nothing can happen. It's a new government and we don't even know, so we have to wait. And that's not a good answer either. And then finally is one of the ones that's hard to see, but that happens a lot, is this idea of fake remedies. And that is, we often like to try to define the problem to fit the skills we have for today. So we might need to do some new things. We may need to think about some things in a different way than we had before, but we like to keep defining the problem as if the skills we have now actually can be applied directly to those challenges of the future. So those are the big elements of what work avoidance looks like. And so I just like for folks to come off mute, use the chat. Danny's going to help me here. And here's just a few questions to get us started. I want to take a few minutes and talk about it. How good are we? How good are we at supporting over directing? Are we pretty good at giving people room to try? Do we shield people from their responsibility? Do we like to solve for them or protect them? Or do we, sometimes what shielding people looks like is, I'm going to package this challenge in such small bites that it's very easy for others to consume. I'm not delegating much complexity. People aren't having to struggle too much. That's another way we shield people. And then finally, I think interestingly, I'd love to hear what are your experiences? Where does work avoidance show up? Where is it that people either cynicism or those false remedies, where does work avoidance usually show up in really difficult change for us? So pick any one of those. Yep, thank you, Britt. It's open mic. But do we shield people? Are we pretty good at giving them some room to try? And then if you're going to see work avoidance, where is it likely going to unfold? Or is it likely going to show up?
Comienzo yo.
Ernesto, I think I heard you first.
Okay. Respecto a la primera pregunta, how good are we supporting over directing others? Yo creo que hay siempre una situación en donde hay un poco de ambas. Hay un poco de soporte y de dirección. Lo conversamos en el grupo, en las discusiones previas dentro del grupo. Muchas veces hay una directriz, un objetivo, un norte hacia donde uno quiere llegar. Y ese muchas veces es un poco inamovible. Ese es el objetivo, donde la dirección de la compañía o la dirección del área o del departamento quieren llegar y sabemos hacia dónde. El cómo, el tránsito de corto plazo es tal vez donde haya más espacio para ir dando soporte y flexibilidad para darle a nuestros reportes o a nuestros equipos. Y es ahí en ese ámbito en donde uno muchas veces cuesta, pero es necesario darle ciertos grados de libertad o darle ciertas autonomías de tal manera que vayan haciendo el propio camino y vayan tomando ciertas decisiones y uno ir siendo una especie de soporte, tal cual como dice. Pero finalmente, el objetivo final, esa directriz, ese norte, ya está definido.
I love that. I love that, Ernesto. The rules on team-based processes say, if the outcome is precision and accuracy, like make no errors, then you adhere to the process relentlessly. The process is what creates clarity and lack of errors. But when the outcome is unknown and we're getting to someplace new and the task could be considered more creative, then you release the process and you get super clear about the outcome, super clear about where we're going. I love the way you said that, which is ownership will come through them having choice and letting them struggle with some of that along the way. And we oftentimes want to lock it in and drive to the outcome when part of the healthy nature of the change is people finding the way as we go forward. Thank you. Thank you for that. What else? Anybody and some thoughts about work avoidance? Has anybody seen such a thing?
Ernesto ayer.
You've seen this in real life.
Discutimos esto en el grupo también. De hecho, fue un tópico respecto de que, más aún en la situación de hoy, en la contingencia actual, en donde estamos llenos de reuniones, el Teams y el Zoom nos agobian por ciertos momentos, esta sensación de que tenemos una carga de trabajo extremadamente alta, creo que se ha hecho evidente muchas veces con esto de mirar hacia el lado, de evitar un trabajo adicional, porque la comunicación entre los equipos se ha hecho más difícil. Entonces sí, me da la sensación de que existe, y en la contingencia actual es aún más patente, digamos.
Yeah, because people are so overwhelmed, or there's so much going on also, right? It sounds like there's so many inputs that they also are, it's hard to know. I think that's right. And the context, let's not minimize the socio-political context in Peru. It's not where everybody's living, but it's where the decisions are getting made at the headquarters and at the functions. And it is disorienting. Thank you for that. Who else? Who else?
Denis, yo quería
Please.
complementar
Hey, José.
con un punto en que a veces nos cuesta aceptar que no sabemos algo, ¿no? Y eso a veces puede ser duro, pero el reconocer que no sabes algo y ser totalmente transparente, oye, ok, probablemente ahí a veces caigamos en, no conozco algo, probablemente me vaya a equivocar, nos cuesta equivocarnos, por lo que a veces prefiero ir por lo seguro y por lo que ya conozco y dedicarme a esto. Entonces, eso creo que a veces nos cuesta, pero una vez que podemos abrirlo y poder ser transparente con esto, creo que ganamos un montón, ganamos velocidad y más bien ganamos proactividad para empezar a meternos a nuevas cosas, de repente equivocarnos, aprender, pero compartir también sobre todo eso, ¿no? Creo que ese es un punto importante que nos está pasando.
My gosh, Jose, I am totally with you. I think when the path isn't really clear and we're thinking about experiments, we could just be wrong too, even if we think we know. And so I think this idea that saying, I'm not sure, or here's some directions I think, where do you think we should go, that it does a couple things for you. It socializes the ideas and it makes people think. And I think that is authentic leadership. It gets us 3 or 4 things, right? It certainly gets us better ideas, but it also shows us and builds trust, shows us in a different way by building trust. So I love that. And that gets us a huge amount. One more. Jaime, Paolo.
Hola, Denis. Yo comparto mucho las ideas que estaban transmitiendo. Lo que es muy importante, y lo discutíamos en el grupo, es la honestidad con la que uno conversa con las personas, porque esa honestidad va a crear unos lazos de confianza para que puedan transmitir los problemas que estén atravesando, ¿no? Y eso va a ayudar mucho en el proceso de cambio y en la adaptación al cambio que pueda haber, igualmente para evitar esas aversiones que puedan existir, ¿no? Sentir que están sobrecargados de trabajo, o que siempre lo han hecho así, no quieren cambiar la forma de hacerlo, o que simplemente se sientan perdidos porque no tienen la visión completa en la coyuntura actual, ¿no? Entonces, temas que son bien importantes es la honestidad y la conversación con las personas para que pueda ser franca y por llegar a entender qué es lo que estas personas necesitan para que realmente puedan hacer de manera efectiva el cambio que necesitan hacer y por llevarlo adelante. Eso era, Denis, lo que quería compartirles.
Oh, well, thanks for saying that. And one of the interesting conversations that we've had with your senior team is when we do have trust, when we have a higher degree of psychological safety, when people are willing to speak up, it means that they're going to bring us more conflict and more tension and more different views because we asked them, right? If we've done it right, people are going to bring you some more differing kind of views, and they can say, look, we're trying to do too many things. Look, I don't know, like what's going on here. But you want to hear it, right? Because that is that song beneath the waves. That is what people aren't saying that we have to keep guessing at. And us building that trust lets it come to the surface. And then once we hear it, we can decide, right, what we can do. Or we can say, well, I don't know. What's the best way for us to go after this? I love that. I'm going to move us, thanks for that. And I'm going to move us into this summary of some of the ideas that we've talked about. That's not it. All right. I must have flipped through about 10 things in a hurry there. All right. So here's the idea for us. And this is one of my favorite pictures when we think about adaptive change. And the idea is, if you look on the left, let's see if I can get my my annotation, or at least my mouse in here. If you look on the left, this is the path. This is the path of a technical challenge. That is, if it's a really difficult technical challenge, it usually starts very disorienting, but then it gets very clear. Like SAP, how's that going to work? When we think about Phoenix, it starts very disorienting. Yeah, please.
Sorry, you're not sharing, at least to me. Is anybody?
I do see it. Ernesto, you don't see the screen share?
Oh, let me see. No.
Ernesto, I'll chat with you because others are seeing it. I'll chat with you separately.
Okay. Thank you, Flor.
This is a technical challenge, Ernesto. I just let me point it out. So let me get rid of that. Okay, so on the left, and then you see me after class, Ernesto, if this makes no sense to you because you can't see the graphic. On the left, that gray bar tells us that's the path of a technical challenge. It's very disorienting at the beginning, but then it quickly gets clear. We get to experts and we might find one bump along the way where, oh, we didn't know that, but then we figure it out. And so very quickly it gets less disorienting, and then it's just hard work. But the black line is adaptive change. Adaptive change evolves over time. It doesn't seem very disorienting in the beginning, but then as we learn more about it, we realize how much we don't know. And so we get up and we think, oh, that's really disorienting. And then I think I got it. But then you realize you don't got it. We do not have it. And then you get another bump of disorientation and disequilibrium because, oh man, we just learned a bunch more and it's more complex than we thought. Then you think you have got that mastered, and then you realize, oh, that we still don't have it. After about that third peak, after about the third time, people are like, oh, I thought we understood this, and it keeps changing. That's when work avoidance, you'll see that green line. That's when people start to check out. It's usually after about that third cycle of, I thought we had this figured out and we don't quite have it yet. People start exhibiting work avoidance. They start doing what they know how to do. They start not paying attention to priorities. So that's when we watch out for it. And then there is usually a couple more bumps along the way as an adaptive challenge unfolds. And so adaptive challenges tend to go on longer because of the experimentation than technical challenges. And that's why when I talk about the importance of holding steady, it becomes really important because these things extend over time. Now, that little gray bar in the top half of the picture is funny stuff. It's called the zone of productive disequilibrium. And so I don't know how that translates into Spanish, but I love that term. So the zone of productive disequilibrium, and that is you want people above that threshold of change, but you don't want them to pop out beyond their limit of tolerance. So I want you uncomfortable. I want you to not know it all, and still I need you to move forward. That's the magic of how do we keep people in these adaptive changes. And you've already talked about many of the solutions, about checking in quite often, making sure we really understand what people are feeling and thinking, making sure that I can express the felt sense of loss that people have moving to this new way and their true concerns. All of those things keep people in that zone and keep them from checking out or doing things that are not useful for the change that we need to have. So that's kind of my summary slide. And the idea, I think the final thoughts here are, the key for us is to hold steady. If it's truly an adaptive change, the key is to hold steady and take the heat. That is, people are going to be uncomfortable. They're going to look to you to solve it. We have to give the work back with empathy. We have to be patient and let them try. Let them come up with ideas and expect them to help solve it, not solve it for them. And ask the questions. We talked about that, how, what, or why, but ask the tough questions and frame them as open questions, because that, again, has people, it will engage them in the thinking and then rather than just the doing. And as Jose and a couple people have said, we have to encourage experimentation. Well, what can you try? What's the first next step? How could we go about that? How would we prove that that's true or not true? But you have to engage people in the conversation to get them moving so that you keep the momentum and they don't wait or freeze. So that's our story about adaptive change. And here's what I'd like to do is, if people have questions, put them in the chat or talk with me on the break. But I'd like you to take a break for 8 minutes. We're going to come back on the half hour and then stand up, walk around, get something to drink. And then I'm going to shift gears and we're going to talk about working on your playbook. How will I lead going forward in this really difficult context of today? How will I lead? What can I bring to Alicorp? How will that be different in my own personal change, leadership? So we're going to make it personal and get into some small breakouts when we come back. Let's take that as an 8-minute break, Flor, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Okay.
Back. That, Jaime, that's a great question, because one of the, I think one of the Jaime's questions in the chat, this idea of oftentimes adaptive changes are clearest in retrospect. That is, after we've been through the cycle, we look back and we see all the bumps and what it took. But I think there's a few things we do. One is we watch our people. There's one piece which is in the middle of it, is we're watching for the complacency, or we're watching for people to wait instead of act and bring ideas. We're also looking for those where do we see the work avoidance, where people aren't staying focused. We know we have more to go, but people are starting to slow down or they seem to be disoriented. Those are the things we can actually see coming and we can predict, so that when they do pop up on our radar, we know how to react. Then there is going to be how does it all end, right? And so if it is, here we are with socio-political turmoil in the country, and we're not sure how that's going to work out, we probably can make some good guesses that over the course of the next 6 to 9 months, things will get clearer. Some things will, cabinets in place, choices will get made, and things will evolve that we have to stay in touch with. But we will know when we have some new ways of operating with a new government, right? And it's hard to say when is that, right? But what we're going to be doing is watching the landscape, and it's like a bow wave on a boat. We're going to slowly watch it unfold, but we'll be watching for, now we have some new ways of operating in a new context within the country, if that was the challenge. And then you'll have a variety of other ones. But saying this is when it's done on adaptive stuff is really hard, but getting clear on an objective about what does it mean to be operational with new ways of thinking, we can actually get clearer there. So really appreciate that question. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to get into about 20 minutes of discussion, and the idea is this. And this is for tomorrow. So we we're going to give you a block of time to just think about what is the playbook that you'll have as a small group, as a team. And the context that we've been talking about that I do want to reframe is that you cannot think about leading at Alicorp today without considering the socio-political context in Peru, right, in the headquarters country that we find ourselves in. There is potential disruption in the government that can have tremendous implications to the business. And that is right, we're right in the middle of that big adaptive change right now. So that is a context setting piece. The questions for your discussion in your small groups are knowing what we know at this moment, knowing it's not clear, but knowing what we know at this moment, how will you plan to lead change into this uncertain future? What are some of the things that you can do? And what can you contribute in your role? So how do we help move the organization forward? Those are the two questions, which is, what is it about my personal leadership that has to change, and how will I contribute looking forward and being an effective change leader at Alicorp, given where we're living today? Now, the discussion that you're having, it doesn't have to be a presentation. It doesn't have to be a slide. I mean, if you had a slide, that's great if you want to do that. But consolidate in your group those few ideas about what it's going to take to lead in the current difficult context, and how will we contribute? Because we're going to have a chat with directors and VPs tomorrow about what are some of the pieces in your playbook, what are some of the chapters, what are some of the ideas you have about leading in this current context. So we want to give you a little bit of time now to have a discussion and get your head around some ideas, so you'll have those fresh in your mind for tomorrow. Danny and I will pop into the breakouts, as is helpful. Yes, thanks, Flora. It is tomorrow. Danny and I will pop into the breakouts, but we'll take 20 minutes and just think about the context that you're living in and some of these ideas around adaptive change, and what is it about you that needs to be different, and how will you contribute as we look forward. Let's go into those breakouts, and if you have questions, just throw up your hand. We're happy to come in and help thrash it around.
Hello, Oscar.
Jaime, I'm gonna call on you tomorrow. I missed the sound of your voice, so I want to warn you now. When I'm gonna call you out tomorrow when in the mix. Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is a nice few minutes to just consolidate some of your thinking around some of the new ideas that we're talking about on adaptive leadership. Tomorrow, we're gonna have some more time for you to sharpen and tune in this idea of a playbook. But Britt and I and the team think it's great to be able to take a little time and translate it to think about the application of this to our own personal leadership. So Britt, in the last 2 or 3 minutes, over to you, my friend.
For sure. Bueno, equipo, muchísimas gracias por quedarse hasta el final. Muchísimas gracias por las reflexiones profundas, las preguntas, el compartir. Un par de consejos para la última sesión, que es su sesión 4 de 4, el día de mañana, que es que puedan revisar el caso TSEI. Es un caso que también revisaron los directores, así que no olviden revisar, es como el pre-work para mañana, quien no lo ha hecho. Si tienen alguna consulta, me escriben y no hay problema para encontrar el material. Y lo último, solo hacer un ajuste, no sé cómo decirlo, una aclaración. Mañana quienes nos van a acompañar para revisar el playbook, que es esta como síntesis de los aprendizajes que han tenido, o estos como do's and don'ts en gestión de cambio, en liderando el cambio. Uno es Alfonso Krittler, director de Bolivia, y también desde el lado de SM tenemos a una business partner de recursos humanos, que es Mafe Pinillos. Así que nada, con ellos vamos a estar compartiendo esa información, ese material que ustedes han elaborado hoy. Y ya, eso es todo. De verdad que muchísimas gracias. No sé si Dan y Denis quieren complementar con algo. Si no, hasta mañana.
Just just don't be surprised if I call you out on the case study tomorrow. So make sure you do your homework. That's what I always tell you. So we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you all so much.
All right, team.
Thank you for all.